here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the author Rob Janicke, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry and all the other groovy stuff. Has published a book which is absolutely fantastic, titled Slacker, 1991, Teen Spirit Angst and the Generation It Created. Available from all good bookshops and also online. I will put a link in the notes below so you'll be able to click on his website and find out how to buy a copy of this fantastic publication. So after several minutes of interest but casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject of the early formative years. Rob, it's over to you.
It's amazing that you said what you just said, because Space Oddity was the song that I was, so I'll go back a bit, but I'm going to get to Space Oddity. So growing up, I was in a single family home raised by my mother, and I have a younger sister, and she always played music in the house, and top 40 radio. And I'm 52, so I was born in 73. So all the glam stuff was happening when I was a baby. And my mom was not listening to that. She was listening to what she grew up with: the Beatles, the Stones, Elvis Presley, American R&B, things like that. And then like top 40 people, like say Billy Joel, Elton John, you know. So I was exposed to that first, and I think it gave me an ear for melody, because a lot of that is very, singable, and it's good melody, good vocal patterns and whatnot. But I was probably about 10, maybe 11 at the latest, but I think closer to 10, which would have been 1983.
Yes.
When I was in a friend's basement, just hanging out as friends do, and he had a couple of older brothers, and they were always playing music. And for whatever reason, on this day, they were like, you guys have to listen to this. And they played two artists, Iron Maiden and David Bowie.
Right.
Very, very different from one another, obviously. But when I heard Space Oddity, I didn't know what I was listening to. It was so fascinating. It was like, I heard these weird sounds, and it did sound like a spaceship. And I was listening to the words, and he's going up in space. Now I'm 10 years old, so I'm thinking this man is really flying up to space and all this stuff. And it left me thinking, like, okay, music is just not, I want to hold your hand, or love me tender, or, scenes from an Italian restaurant. This could be something too. And that set me on a path of trying to find, or when I did eventually find weirder or different types of music, like in my mind, Bowie was at that point, I was really attracted to it. So it's really funny that you have the same one. That Space Oddity.
Yes, Space Odyssey. Yeah. I think there was a bit of sort of romantic melancholia that I quite liked, because also in those days, this again being the late 60s, early 70s, my mum listened to the radio, and mothers at that time spent a lot of time in the kitchen and housework, because there wasn't all this kind of automatic stuff. There weren't automatic washing machines in our life at that stage. And so there was a lot of time listening to radio too, which was the kind of light radio. But it had songs by people like Burt Bacharach and the Carpenters, who I just absolutely loved their music and loved the lyrics. So later on in life, when I got into Joy Division and the Smiths, I think, oh, this is just like, the songs of Karen Carpenter or, Burt Bacharach. They're all dealing with sort of heartache and romance, but mostly heartache, aren't they, and rejection and loneliness. So there was a kind of common thread, but also this beautiful music that, the melody, the chord structure, the orchestral arrangements. It was very clever. But again, it kind of, it's embedded. You can't embed something that's kind of in your brain at that age. And then I had an older brother who was 7 years older, and in the 70s he'd got into prog rock, so it was all the bands, Yes, Genesis, Wishbone Ash, and bizarrely there was like Goodbye Yellow Brick Road in his collection, and Sergeant Pepper, and this was the mid-70s, so there was no cultural context at that stage. They were just kind of records, and the Beatles seemed like they were just another era, and you thought, God, they'd only been broken up about 3 to 5 years, but it seemed like the chapter had so gone. And at the time you thought, God, that's so weird, that we were onto the solo albums of like Band on the Run and those sort of stuff. So that was kind of very much what the 70s were like, and top 20, top 40 radio in the UK, which obviously is huge because, a song would go in at number 40 and then climb three places and then four places. So you've got this long story with each record that would go in slowly. They didn't just go at number one and then go out again. It was like a long, months. That's why we remember all those lyrics.
Yeah, no, that I mean, especially at such a young age where your impression, I don't know, music does hit you, or people like us, I guess, differently. There's science behind it. There's reports, and there's people who've dedicated their lives to figuring out why music hits us the way it does at times. And in the younger years, yeah, I mean, maybe people like us are predisposed to melody or a feeling. You mentioned melancholy, right? So
Yes.
music can make you feel something, as well as just hearing it. And when that happens, man, I tell you, it will, all these years later, I can hear a song from the 70s or 80s that I might not really listen to much anymore, if at all. But it'll come on and I will automatically, within one or two lines, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember this one. And then, even though I cannot sing, I'll still sing the rest of it. And I'll get
Yes.
most of the lyrics right because it's just embedded in us. You're right.
It's all there. And actually, with Space Oddity, there were, at that time, this was the reissue, which was more the mid-70s, but there was also Elton John's Rocket Man, and there was all
Yeah.
these stories of space and looking at the moon thinking, oh my God, there could be astronauts there tonight. Can you see anything? No, not really. But, when you're young, it was a slightly, that story was happening at the time. But in the USA, you would have still had Vietnam, even though you were only
Yeah.
3 at the time. But that was still, your mother and your, family would have been that would have been on the news until the mid 70s, wouldn't it?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And it did, we were in I guess, I know we, meaning my generation, a post-war culture in a way, because all of the adults, when Vietnam was over, um, it was still a topic. It was still talked about. People, my dad went to Korea, but he was it was during Vietnam War. They sent people to different places, and he was just
Yes.
lucky enough to go to Korea. But it was a thing. It was a thing that lasted, and we grew up hearing some of those stories. Um, and then when I got a little bit older, or I guess a lot older, by 1990, and they had the first Desert Storm, that first war in the Middle East with the United States, um, I think we all, like the kids, went back and we were like, wow, this is happening again. But now we're older and we were afraid that we were going to be a part of it all. It was just, yeah, uh, strange times. But all of that, in my opinion, always affects art. Music in particular. But, well, not just music, movies and books and things like that. Um,
Yes.
it's people want to write about culture, and usually, again, I'll go back to what you said, the melancholy of it all. People are inspired maybe by sad or unfortunate situations.
Yes, and it was interesting because the 60s was all about revolution and the culture, counterculture, wasn't it, really? But then the 70s came along, and then you had the singer-songwriters from Lauren Canyon, and then you had yacht rock, didn't you? And these very clever bands coming along. So suddenly music becomes an academic form, doesn't it? It becomes very technically kind of proficient, and people are spending, amazing amount of time getting productions and guitar solos, and it's all got very intricate. Lyrically, we have no idea what they're talking about, but they're apart from the Tapestry album by Carole King and Joni Mitchell and a bit of Neil Young, but a lot of that Steely Dan stuff, and then
No
various
idea what
other.
they were singing.
Yes,
Yeah.
but it's kind of there. It's sort of people start doing more self-help stuff. They're not going to change society anymore, so they're going to just have a good time and sort of like concentrate on the individual, really, isn't it? At that point
Mhm.
during the 70s period, everyone had bought Frampton Comes Live, and then there's that kind
Yeah.
of series of kind of rock and AOR and like I said, the dreaded yacht rock period, which it starts to sort of you had Nixon, then you have Carter, don't you? And then eventually Reagan. So your 70s politically does change quite a bit at that time.
It absolutely did, and it's funny because, again, culture and music, they sort of they sort they sort of go hand in hand because when things are okay, I don't know, maybe music isn't as aggressive or isn't as dangerous. When things change, and not just in the United States, but over in England, I mean, you know, one of my favorite bands of all time are the Clash. I think, for a band, lyrically, the raw sound that they have, that they had, especially in the beginning, um, everything just felt like it was so needed and necessary at that time. And if you look at culture and history, particularly in your country, uh, and what they were singing about, writing about, and playing about, they played with such ferocity. It was not like, long guitar solos and funny dances on stage. They were a gang, in a way.
Yes.
um, and music, music can do that. And again, if you follow history, we had a series of pop music in the 80s and the mid 80s in the United States. Uh, the country was doing well. There was a lot of money. Everybody was infatuated with celebrity. And then here comes Nirvana, crashing down and breaking down doors. And I know they weren't the first, but they're the ones that got, that initial shine. So yeah, music and culture are very closely related. And yeah, you can get some softer, non-aggressive music when things are okay, and it always swings back the other way when stuff changes.
Yes, that's an interesting point, but we'll come to that later. But then, yeah, so there's a term you use, which I hadn't come across apart from when I met another American years ago who called a latchkey kid.
Mm,
So, yes, so that plays a big part in your childhood, doesn't it?
sure. At the time, I was in grammar school or grade school, like, from maybe not as young as first grade, but certainly by fourth or fifth grade, and then through sixth and seventh and whatnot. Um, I had a key to my home, and my mom was always working. And I would have to wait for my sister at our. We went to the same school. She was two years younger than me, 2 grades younger than me, and we would walk home. I'd have to walk her home together, um, and go into the house by ourselves. No parent, no adult, and survive. I mean, I have two young kids now. I mean, they're youngish. They're 12 and 9. Um, but I could never imagine leaving my kids at 10 or 9, walking into a home by themselves with no adult. It would be insane to me to do that. But in my generation growing up, that's what a lot of kids had to do, especially because I grew up in the age of in the United States. Um, it was the largest, or I should say, there was the largest amount of divorce in the country's history, right when I was in that age group. So there were a lot of us who had to, have a key to the house and go in, shut the door, lock it, and wait for mom to come home, whenever that might be.
Yes, I think you mentioned the statistics in the book,
Yeah,
don't you, about sort
we
of
do.
therapy and suicide, and
Yeah.
and we're not talking about the two bands there. We're talking about the mental
Right.
condition.
That's right. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, so there you go.
That's a good
Yes.
point.
So then yes, God. So then your 80s then. So you're still quite young during the 80s, aren't you? When do you buy your first record, your first single or first album?
I was just talking about this the other day with somebody, in light of Ozzy Osbourne's death. I think it was Bark at the Moon. I was 10 years old. I think that came out in 1983. And there used to be a big department store that was in all the main shopping malls that would have a record section. And I was in there one day with my mom, and I had had records from her collection and whatever. But I remember seeing Ozzy Osbourne's cover of Bark at the Moon. He's a werewolf. It looks incredibly scary to a 10-year-old. Um, and I asked her, I said, "Can you get this for me?" And she did. So, not with my own money because I was 10, but I think that's the first record I ever really asked for.
Right.
Um, yeah. Yeah. So
So,
that would be it. As I got a little older, I mean, then, it changed and I got to go buy records once I started getting little part-time jobs here and there. But
and
that
then
that
did
record,
you
I think, was.
And I think you mentioned during that sort of 80s period, did you sort of become aware of, those classic songs by Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson and Culture Club as well, didn't you? And
Yeah.
Ghostbusters. So were you obsessed with the MTV generation at this stage?
Absolutely. As soon as I was a little young. I think MTV also started. I think it started in '81. But I was very aware of it when it happened. We did not have cable television in my neighborhood at that point, so you had back then you had to wait for the cable companies to wire your neighborhood for cable. But my early memories of videos were Friday night, a television show called Friday Night Videos, and obviously Saturday Night Live would have bands play live. So that was the only kind of visual I had of music, and I remember at a very early age loving all of that. But no, those early '80s bands, they were all the Police would be another one. With Every Breath You Take, when Synchronicity came out, and again, I think that was also 1983, if I have that right. Um, all over top 40 radio, with Michael Jackson, Prince, Culture Club, Madonna, George Michael. I mean, I remember all of it vividly because, we had television, which again, I didn't have cable for a while. So I had about 9 television channels and radio. That was the only entertainment I had.
Yes.
And
Well,
I loved music from an early age. So the radio was always on.
yes, God, that's quite interesting, isn't it? That whole sort of time, because we had only, I mean, I'm not competing, but we only had three, and then we had Channel 4, which was very exciting. But we did, I suppose, being a small country, I think culture kind of moved very quickly because we had 3 weekly music papers like the NME, Sounds and Melody Maker.
Yeah.
So that they all had huge circulations and all had a slightly different demographic. And then we had a DJ called John Peel who had
Yeah.
this massive influence on people because any new band coming along had a shot of being able to get onto Radio 1. And then, even though it seemed very niche at the time, it still was enough for a new band to get a bit of traction. And being such a tiny little country, I mean, every city and town would have an alternative indie night somewhere. And with a trusty transit van, a band could sort of get on the road and do the little circuit of these indie nights, knowing that they'll get 150, 200 people turning up because they've heard the John Peel and they've read an
Sure.
article in the NME. So, at least you felt like there was a progression. But interesting enough, because you said, America was generally doing well economically. In the UK, things weren't going very well economically. You had Thatcher, and you mentioned Thatcher in the book, but then,
Yeah.
there was like, that was the right of centre and her philosophy. And then you had this massive unemployment and the left, on the other side, this completely. And we'd had the Falkland War, the miners' strike, and then Greenham Commons. So the threat of nuclear war was in the air. And there was a huge amount of unemployment. So I think that's why there were so many indie bands that started, because people just said, there's no jobs, there's no future, but we'll just be in a band. So I think out of that comes all these kind of, yes, guitar-based bands singing about loneliness and heartache. Well, I'm talking about the Smiths, really, aren't I?
Well,
On that.
well, yeah, and it's interesting. The way you phrased all that made me think that and obviously my experience was different because I'm not from your country, and nor are we the same age. So everything I learned about what was happening in England, I learned after it was already popular. But my musical, I don't know, education, I guess you can say, was very, very much from England. Uh, again, with the Beatles and the Stones right off the bat, from what I would listen to with my mother's radio. But then the stuff I really started liking, not that I don't like those bands, I do, but I started getting into heavier music. So it would be Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, The Who. I already mentioned The Clash. Um, there was such it seemed like, in my mind, like that was the place to be. That's where music is really happening. And I guess maybe the way you just described it, because it is small and because people didn't have much hope, I guess, at that point, they had all of this in their own backyard. They were looking up at all of these people. And I'm not even mentioning the prog rock people or that. Like, so they probably said, yeah, well, they did it. I can do it. And the country's small enough that I can get around here pretty quickly, and make a name for myself. So when I was a little kid, I do remember saying that, and I still haven't done it yet, but I always wanted to go to London because I wanted to visit all the places I heard people sing about.
Yes, oh yes,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I know, but it's fascinating. Actually, we went to London last week to see this new play, which was God, what's it called? Oh God. See, my short-term memory is completely gone, and because
Mine's
everyone
going to.
yes, God, what did we go and see last week in London? God, this is a fascinating bit of interview, isn't it? It's because everyone always thinks that I'm going, oh, you're talking about the band. I said, no, this is not the band. Oh God, that is so brilliant. I'm so
Yeah.
pleased. I forgot that, and I've spoken about it to everybody. And then when I see it, it was the Duke of York Theatre. Bloody right, it was. And Stereophonic, that's what it was going
Oh,
to be.
okay.
So everyone thinks it's a film about, or a play about the band.
Right.
But it was based in 1972, 73. It is really the story of Fleetwood Mac in a lot of ways. And they've made their first album. They've gone to the studio to make the second album, and suddenly they get the pressure to write. It becomes bigger, the first album, so they get this pressure to write a new album, and the music's by the guy from the Will Butler from Arcade Fire. So
Oh,
yes,
wow.
we're always harking back to another period to get it kind of excited by, aren't we? Really. So yes, I sort of forgot there was that period of those super bands like the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac in the 70s, which kind of ran the airwaves during that late period and then into the 80s quite a lot, really. So I have no idea what that's connected to, actually, to this bit. But your childhood, yes. Well, it's funny that I mentioned that because I did an interview with these two guys who just did this book called Buzz Me In,
Oh,
which
yeah,
is
yeah.
about the record plant,
Sure.
studio.
Right. In
So
New York City.
that's worth the read if you get a chance. So as the 80s progressed, in the book, your book, Jesus, keep with one book. Yes, you talk about early rap, which was quite interesting
Yeah.
because John Peel, the DJ that I love, and
Yep.
I'll name drop all the time.
Well, the Peel sessions, not to interrupt you, the Peel sessions I found in probably the late 80s or early 90s, maybe early 90s, and I was fascinated by it because to me that was like it's not here. I can't have not very easy access to it. But whenever I was able to get something that had Peel sessions on it, even if I didn't know the band, I listened to it because it was that cool to me at the time. So I'm sorry, but go ahead.
Yes, no, and it was just the fact that he introduced us to all the early rap. Like
Yeah.
there was, I mean, there was the obvious ones. Well, they weren't obvious at the time because that was Public Enemies, Yo, Bum Rush the Show, LL Cool J. There was other ones like on Sleeping Bag Records, Tila Rock, and then he played. Oh, you mentioned Marley Marl, which was great because there was another
Yeah.
artist called Roxanne Shante and the Real
Yeah. Sure.
Roxanne, which had these kind of things. There was a battle about a bridge, which from being in the UK, I had no idea why they were so worried about a bridge. I mean, you've seen one, you've seen them all, but I guess it was been gang warfare, wouldn't it? But being a white kid in England, we thought it was good. And then it was a compilation, a record label called Street Sounds that would bring out these compilations. Because I made the mistake of once buying an album by a band who I thought, oh, that's a great single. I realised they only had one great song on the album to my expense. But then this guy, Morgan Khan, brought out Street Sounds and they were just brilliant. And then I actually went to the UK Fresh event in 1986 to see all these bands like Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five and Mantronic and African Barbata. And it was, it was like, oh my God, my ears got absolutely wrecked because everyone in those days, this was the mid 80s, would blow the whistle. And then you talk about the most iconic or the most important album in that kind of world was the Run DMC, wasn't it? Raising Hell.
Commercially, absolutely. When that happened, and just to give you one of the reasons why rap and hip hop were so important to me, it's a New York based medium, right? It's a New York based genre, and there, not that I was a part of it, I certainly wasn't. But you take a little bit of pride maybe in that. Oh wow, these guys are like some were from Brooklyn where I was living, so a lot from the Bronx in the early days, people they were all over New York, and so you knew the references when they were rapping about streets or neighborhoods or stores. Like you knew them. They were local to you, and the sound was so different and interesting. And I think in the book I talk about it, especially with Public Enemy, almost being like punk rock. It was brand new. It was in your face. It was aggressive. Now, a little different with Run DMC. It was probably a little bit more commercial, and they had the big hit with Aerosmith when they did their, Walk This Way version. But prior to that, um, yeah, Run DMC was a big deal, as was LL Cool J, with his album Bigger and Deffer. The Beastie Boys as well. That was early. That was 1986, and
Yes. Well, the Beastie Boys brought all that. I don't know what they were doing in York. I don't know if it was they were stealing the something from a car, weren't they, and hanging it around their neck, some sort of sign. That was a
it
very
was a
rebellious.
it was a Volkswagen sign. Yeah, it
Right.
was like,
People probably
yeah.
don't realise how annoyed the public got with that, but they got very annoyed, didn't they?
People were stealing them. Yeah, people were stealing them off cars. But it was wild. It was such a fresh, not to use a rap term, but it was a fresh and an interesting time for music. And and now I didn't really know this at the time. I don't think I was able to really understand. But looking back and being a writer, and I've been writing ever since I was a teenager, poetry, song lyrics, whatever, and then evolving into other things. Um, I love the fact that rap was based on words. As much as I loved music, as much as I loved melody, you mentioned Paul McCartney earlier and the Beatles, and just the beautiful melodies that would come from rock music at times. But rap was words. They were telling stories with words, and the music was almost secondary. And I just thought that was really cool. And I've never looked
Did
back.
you enjoy the marriage of sort of metal and lyrics, though? Like whether it was the Beastie Boys or Run DMC and Aerosmith. Was it the kind of the rock guitar as well as the beat that got you kind of excited?
Yeah, it definitely played a role because I grew up with rock music. I was a rock music fan first. So the fact that Run DMC did, excuse me, have guitars, and the Beastie Boys, obviously, because they played instruments. So yeah, that was definitely a part of it. But I will say that some of the people I liked the most at the time, along with them, KRS-One, and Boogie Down
Oh,
Productions,
yes.
um, and Eric B. and Rakim. They were a little bit later, maybe
Oh,
2 or 3
God,
years later.
yes, yes. That was
And
a
there,
classic.
yeah, and there was no rock in that for them almost exclusively. No, I don't think any of those records had rock guitar in it. Um, so yes, initially I think I'm like, oh, this is something familiar. I hear the guitar, but everything else about the genre really spoke to me for one reason or another. And it was really important in my mind, the way I look at it. It gave people from my generation the okay to like something new. So a little bit later, when grunge and alternative and all that started to really like come to the forefront, even though it was rock music, it was a newer version of it, and we were already okay with listening to something new. And in my opinion, I think rap played a big role in that.
Yeah, because actually it does. There was the Daisy Age, wasn't there, that came along, and there was also another band which was I went to see live called is it Stetsasonic as well?
Yes, that's a Sonic. Yeah, and they played instruments as well.
They did, and then there was the oh God, who was I actually went to see them. Was it Digital Underground? Was there a band?
Digital and yeah, there's a back.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
So
yeah.
there was kind of a lot of different. I mean, it progressed very fast because I think the initial days, the technology wasn't quite there. I do remember seeing one or two quite rough gigs live, and it was just you know they were. I suppose they took a while before they could get the technology up to speed. But in your book, you mentioned an important event that happened 40 years ago that we were all excited, the great Live Aid event that happened both sides of the Atlantic, didn't we? There was London and Philadelphia. So can you remember much about that at the time?
I remember, yes. So I remember my memory of it is more of the excitement around it and the just the massive scope that it was. Because back then, I mean, we live in a world now where the world is tiny. You and I are talking from, however many thousands of miles away,
Yes.
different time zones, different countries. So now it's all normal. Back then, I remember thinking, how is this possible? How are we going to watch something happening in England and something happening in the States at the same time? You didn't understand it, not as a kid, as a young kid. It was so the magnitude of it and the amounts of people that they were talking about that were going to tune in. That I remember as a big story. I do remember some of the performances. A lot of that was probably aided with current technology like YouTube and being able to go back and watch it, and it would jog some memories. But it was, and again, being too young to really go to concerts at that point, certainly by myself anyway, couldn't do that. It was a really cool way to watch some live music. And yeah, it was, I think, and you said it just a few minutes ago, it was a big deal for all of us, who were around for it.
Yes, because I love the fact, and I love books like this that always bring in these other cultural things. Because you mentioned the new Coke coming in, didn't you, as well? This kind of big moment, which is kind of at the time, think, oh, yes, things like that. And then Space Challenger and those kind of moments. And then, the economic meltdown that happened in 87. So on one level, I mean, it was kind of interesting with Reaganomics because it's like, yes, we're going to do this amazing thing. But then they quickly went, this is going really badly. You don't quite know how economics work and the economy. So, there's a lot of shuffling. But at the same time, America did seem to be getting rich. But at the same time, it was all sort of not. And there was Dallas and there was Dynasty and the whole oh God, what's his name? Who was the guy who got shot in Dallas? Who shot JR? That's it.
Shot JR, yeah, JR. Right.
I know, I do like when people mention these cultural moments because actually that's kind of what is happening in mainstream society while we're listening to all this kind of music, which sometimes is mainstream and sometimes it's just below the surface. But I think it all adds to a certain level of what society is going through at the time.
Right, and I think writers or filmmakers or painters or musicians, anyone who is creative in any way, I think you. I mean, I do it, and I would like to believe most other people who create stuff do it as well. You pull from culture, you pull from what's happening around you. You're inspired by it, or you're disgusted by it. You're angry or you're happy, whatever the emotion is that you have by what's happening around you, will and probably should give people ideas. And you want to either, some people just like to document everything, but some people like to fight or rebel against what's happening, or some people like to celebrate what's happening. So culture, in my mind, it goes hand in hand with art and music and all of that. And you'll never run out of inspiration if you pay attention. Something's going to make you happy, something's going to make you angry, something's going to make you sad. So write about it.
Yes. So when you get to 16, you're still at school. Do you then stay on at college at this stage, or do you? Because in England you can just leave at 16 and that's it, and just try and hope that having no qualifications work. But then slowly people start staying on, doing A levels and then getting a degree. What was it like? What was your journey like at that stage?
Yeah, so I did. I went right through high school and straight through college. I never took a break. After my 4 years of college, I stopped, and that was my, So I don't know if it's the same over there, but it was you get like your bachelor's degree, which is your 4-year college degree, and I did that straight right after high school. I didn't take any breaks. I knew people who did, and looking back, I almost wish I did. Some people took a year off and they went and they traveled, or maybe they lived on their own and kind of saw what real life was like and then went to school. Some maybe never went to school after that, but I did. And college was an interesting time because I was a freshman in 1991, and that is the year, obviously it's the year that's in the subtitle, but that's the year commercially that, everything out of Seattle really took off. And to be in college at that point in New York City was an amazing time, because the next several years I was able to go into Manhattan literally every week if I wanted to. And there were many months that I would go in every week to see a band or several bands. Thursday through Sunday, there was somebody playing, and they were from all over the country and all over the world. I saw a band from your neck of the woods in 1990, late 91, maybe, or early 92. Ned's Atomic Dustbin and
yes.
Jesus Jones.
Jesus Jones.
Yeah, they played a place called the Ritz, which no longer exists, but it was this theater that had 2 levels, and that show blew me away. those bands weren't that popular yet, and they did have their moment. Jesus Jones and Ned's even had a minute of popularity, at least here. And I thought they were both great. But this was the thing: like, you could go into Manhattan and anybody could have been playing, whether you knew their names or didn't. You just went to the show.
Yes.
And so it was a great time to be in college and witness that at the age that I was.
Yes, because in the book you mentioned 1987, which I somehow put down as the most important or the best year of music. It's slightly biased, but it was just the albums that came out that year were amazing. But there was also something else I think was quite important, was that for me, I was an indie kid in the 80s, and I put that period is from 83 to 87, which is a little bit sort of sweeping because there were bands before that and a few after. But it was the years of the Smiths, and the Smiths for 5 years was so kind of important. They were there 24/7, releasing albums, doing tours, and all that kind of. And then they break up in 87. And then I feel that every 5 years, roughly, possibly 3 to 5 years, there's a kind of a new shift in music when there's a new generation of 16-year-olds come along and they kind of want their own sound and their own vibe, and they don't really want to have a band who's on their third or fourth album. They want to kind of start again. And at that point, the Smiths broke up, and it was like that period of indie pop in this country, was coming to an end. We'd sort of had our fill, and most bands have a 5-year narrative as well. They have the 12-month honeymoon period. They get a single on the John Peel show, the first album, and then the tour around Europe as well. Then the second album, bit bigger tour, and then the fifth in a year, and the third album. It all goes totally arse up, doesn't it? And they just hate each other, and that's kind of it. And you don't really want the third or fourth album by most bands because you kind of feel like they've done their stuff. So then 87 onwards, ecstasy comes along. So that's kind of a massive new thing for the, drug of choice, I suppose. And dance music appears and you have all that kind of scene. But then you get this like shoegazy music with bands like My Bloody Valentine. And then John Peel plays, and you mentioned this in the book, the Sub Pop 100 compilation that appears, doesn't it? And we'd had sort of like the Buttholes and Husker Du and Sonic Youth and Big Black. But then there's this new kind of sound rumbling in the background. And for me, Bleach was kind of one of those albums which I just thought were amazing. So I went to see them at the Norwich Arts Centre here, and they were supporting Tad, bizarrely. They were the support band. And I
sure,
did,
yeah.
So I did a 45-minute interview with the band, and I think you mentioned it in the book because I had no idea who the members of Nirvana who they were. So there was me with this little tape saying, "And who are you? And who are you?" And that was when Chad was still the drummer, and I still think that was an amazing moment, really. And also, 4AD Records had come out with things like the Pixies and Throwing Muses, and we were like, "Oh my God, 4AD was brilliant!" But then it was like this other sound, and it was very exciting. So that period was very, before 80 and 91, I think the late 80s had suddenly sown the seeds, wasn't there?
Absolutely right. And the fact that, and you just said it, like, Nirvana supporting Tad makes all the sense in the world for that time period. Tad was already out. They were established a little bit up in their corner of Washington State. Nirvana were up and coming, but nobody knew. Nobody thought that scene was ever going to be anything. The people there didn't know, but the folks that ran Sub Pop, they wanted it to happen. So they sent everybody over to England. They sent them wherever they could get, an audience, and drum up some fans. And the bands were good, so it certainly worked. But the bands you mentioned prior to that, Husker Du and Sonic Youth, Pixies, all of those bands they laid the groundwork, the foundation for the bands, like Nirvana or Pearl Jam or Soundgarden and the rest of them. Those later bands were big fans of those earlier bands. So the connection, the lineage doesn't ever go away. It's all there. And all of those bands were certainly fans of the Smiths, going back to who we were talking about. So there's always this connection. And I think, certainly you not knowing who the guys in Nirvana were. I mean, how could you? They were, when they came back, there was, I forget what year, maybe I guess 90 or 91 is when they started to realize, oh, wow, where people are starting to care about us. And to your point about the year itself, 1987, that, and I think I reference it probably, Jane's Addiction, here in the States. They took rock music to a different level. A band like Faith No More also, the Chili Peppers, I guess you can say as well. They were tweaking it. There was, okay, we recognize this is rock music, this is heavy rock music, there's some punk elements, some funk elements, but there's something different here. There's a change. So that's a great year to pick. 87.
Yes, well, yes, so it was interesting because, interesting enough, I suppose with America you had, the bands who get very successful in the 90s had sort of fed from the bands from the 80s. And it was a little bit like that with Britpop in the UK, was that they were all the kids who had seen the indie kids, it's indie bands, who were still quite niche and were just in the indie charts. They were not in the mainstream chart, even though now the record sales look amazing. But they were the students and all at school watching them and again, actually, we might play guitars, but obviously we're not going to go anywhere. But then suddenly Britpop becomes this, thing with Oasis and Blur and all this band, and suddenly people make millions of pounds. But all those indie bands, that I used to love definitely didn't make millions of pounds or any money. So what was your then the 90s then? How do you navigate the 90s period? Because then are you then still at college and then leaving college at this point?
Yeah, so 91, I guess I started the school year begins in like August of 91. Pearl Jam's 10, Nirvana's Nevermind, Soundgarden's Bad Motorfinger. These were all released in the fall of that year. So they were brand new. So when that all started, and it really the big explosion didn't happen until early 92. In January of 92, Nevermind on the Billboard 200 album chart knocked Michael Jackson off. And half the country still had no idea who Nirvana was. So when that happened, it was like a wake-up call. I was like, wow, like how did these three, punk rock, indie rock, whatever you want to call them, these guys, how did they knock Michael Jackson off of the charts? How is this the number one album in the world, or at least in the United States at the time? And from that moment on, it was January of 1992, everything changed. So, yeah, I mean, I navigated it by going to shows, consuming every record I could, hanging out in local record stores and getting imports, mostly from England, for stuff that wasn't out here in the States yet. I still listened to all the bands that I had liked prior, but just a lot less. I focused on all this new stuff. But I did recognize, and then, the internet was, it was nothing. It was barely in its infancy back then. So it wasn't much of a help. But I would read all the magazines and I would watch whatever documentary I could when they would come out. And I would learn about these bands. And I understood that what they were doing was a product of the people they were listening to as they were growing up. And the stuff we were, you and I were talking about earlier. All these guys from Seattle, we'll stick with those bands for now, I guess. Most of them were about 7 to 9 years older than me. So I was born in 73. These guys were born in, 65, 66, 67, like that. So they were listening to a lot of the bands that I had found as I was growing up. And I knew they were a product of all of that. So I never left what I used to like. I'm just now like hearing like whatever that evolution became.
Yes,
and I loved it.
Because you mentioned Ozzy and Iron Maiden in the book quite a lot, but how come the hair metal period didn't sort of grab you during that 80s? Because that was kind of everywhere at that stage, and for a young chap, I would have thought that would have been exciting.
It's really funny because I have a group of friends that I'm still in touch with very, very regularly from college. So back in 90, 91, 92, they're all big hair metal fans. They were back then and they still like it. And we have these conversations. And because I'm a creature of habit to a degree, like I was very slow to transition from, vinyl and cassette and then eventually CD. I was slow to get a cell phone. I like my routine, or I like what I like. So when hair metal came out and it got big, I was listening mainly to rap, because that was right, at the same time, a little bit before it, maybe, for sure. and still the older metal. Like, I wasn't ready to change. I wasn't really like, it didn't. And you know what? Honestly, I think MTV played a role in that for me, because I looked at the bands, and I'm like, to me, they looked ridiculous. I didn't understand. Steve Harris doesn't dress like this. I mean, you know, Iron Maiden wore spandex and stuff like that, but I didn't understand. Even Kiss, right? Kiss is a big, um, it's like a linchpin sort of band for so many metal and hard rock bands. But Kiss, for me, it was like I didn't get it. I didn't get the makeup. I didn't get the look. Not that it's bad, or not that it obviously did wonders for them, but it wasn't appealing. So I stayed
No.
in my little lane, and yeah, it passed me by. I will say, Motley Crue's "Shout at the Devil" I liked a lot. I liked that record. Um, if you want to call Skid Row hair metal, I liked "Slave to the Grind," the record that came out after their big record. Um, so some of those bands resonated a little bit, but not nearly for my like what it did for others in my generation.
So what was it like then, sort of following Nirvana and then sort of their second album and dealing with that and kind of either excitement or disappointment? What was that like for you?
So, as I talked about in the book, I did get a lot of this. Not Nevermind, obviously, but I did get a lot of these bands on that cassette tape that my friend had made me, that mixtape, with bands like Sonic Youth and early Soundgarden. About a Girl from Bleach was on that. Violent Femmes, Jane's Addiction, Buffalo Tom. So I had that cassette for a year or two before Nevermind came out. So I was already sort of primed, I guess, or and there was a lot of anticipation when that happened and these bands were getting popular. I was like, wow, some of these bands from that little cassette tape I was given, like they're the biggest bands in the world now, or that style of music is getting very popular. So I was on board. I was like, I wasn't looking back. I loved it all. I mean, those years from, I'd say, 91 through 96 or 7, even post Kurt's death, obviously, because a lot of people look at that point as when it all ended. But I would go through 97 personally. They were, yeah, for me, I think it was just some of the best musical years of my life. And, you know, somehow I must have felt a part of it. I don't know. I mean, I did. There was a band at the time, a local band that I was doing work with. And when I say work, I was like, driving them around and loading in gear and loading out gear and helping out in the studio. So I did feel like I was a part of a little bit of a local scene, which made me connect to this other bigger scene, maybe.
Yes.
But yeah.
And there was one film, 94, you mentioned, because obviously that's when Kurt kills himself. But there's also, that's when the Kevin Smith film comes out, Clerks,
Yeah.
isn't it? Which
Yeah.
is was that a big thing when that film appeared in your life?
It was. It was shot in New Jersey, which is, if you've been here, if you've been to New York, New Jersey is like a stone's throw away. I mean, you can get over a bridge in 30 minutes from here, 20 minutes from here, and be in New Jersey. So, you know, uh, New York and New Jersey are always connected. I've been there countless times in my life, and still go. Um, so when that happened, it was like, wow, like, I think I've been to that block, or I think I've been to that convenience store, or we know people from those towns. So yeah, you felt like that was, your people and your places. And it was just it was a very different movie, pretty much all dialogue. There's no real action or anything in it. The storylines are interesting. It's just a bunch of kids being kids, and again, timing, man. Timing plays such a role in things for certain um, genres or generations of people. Like, Kevin Smith just nailed it for my generation with that film. So yeah, and of course, the music that went along with it is always a big plus. Just like with singles, Cameron Crowe's Singles from '92.
Yes. So did you, as that 90s progressed, how did you navigate some of those albums by bands who had done a great album and then their second, third album not so brilliant, and definitely things weren't going well with them? How did you keep an interest in that scene and those bands?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. So I'll say yes because I automatically like if I liked something, say with the band's first record or even second record, I would automatically buy the next one without hearing it. I mean, and we heard it. We, there was a single on the radio or maybe a video on MTV, but I didn't need to hear the whole record to buy it. They had already proven to me that they're good and I liked them. That doesn't mean that I always liked what I heard after getting the third record or the fourth record. Interest would eventually start to wane a little bit, but I always gave them the benefit of the doubt. Like every Nirvana record, there weren't many, obviously, there were just three really. But every Pearl Jam record, every Soundgarden record, Alice in Chains, again, not many. Um, those were the bigger bands, I guess you would call them. But I gave them all the benefit of the doubt, and I got them all when they came out. Um, I certainly didn't love everything, and I certainly would maybe have a special place in my heart for the earliest stuff. Um, but again, I felt like it was, quote unquote, my music, and I was going to get it. I was going to buy it.
Yes, because I can't remember, probably months ago, probably not years, but I did an interview with the guy who I suppose was the producer who created the sound. Who was this guy? Is it Michael Binhorn or
Oh, sure, Michael. Yeah, I think Beinhorn.
Bainhorn? Yeah. So
Yeah,
so
yeah.
he was, it was quite interesting because I did notice. So I asked him, I said, "You never worked with the band on any other albums, just the best album?" He said, "Yeah, we had a bad time in the studio and they hated me, but I got the best work from them." And it was like, oh right, at least you're honest. But he was like, he'd say, "No, this isn't a very good song. You need to rewrite it." And it was opposite. Oh, Jesus.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
that's a brave
yeah.
thing, but he was the man who did the albums, which I suppose most people think, yeah, that was their best album. But obviously, he wasn't asked back for the second album, so it was interesting. Well, I suppose the '90s, though, I mean, it starts kind of well, doesn't it? Let's face it. But then during it finished with Woodstock '99, and you look at the covers of Rolling Stone magazine. It goes from sensitive young men to jocks to kind of sort of rapists. I mean, I don't know if you can put sort of rapists, but just like people, it gets a bit rapey, the culture, doesn't it, with blokes at this stage?
It absolutely.
It's a bit of a tricky one, and you've obviously seen the film, and you're thinking, God, that is a bit blokey, isn't it? The decade isn't. It's a hard one to polish sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. It took a nosedive for sure. That's why in my brain I kind of cap it for me at 97, but it could be earlier for more people. By the end of the decade, it's just like anything else that becomes popular. We are a consumer culture. Consumerism, commercialism, capitalism. It's when something hits, everybody wants a piece of it and everybody wants to recreate it and everybody wants to make money off of it. So you take something good and it becomes a shell of itself. It becomes cartoonish. Everybody tries to do the next great thing, and typically it doesn't work. And by the end of the decade, with like new metal, like I think that's probably what you were referencing with the jocks and and you can call them rapists because there's definitely documented accounts of rape at shows and things like that. It became embarrassing, and at that point, I mean, that was it. It was certainly done for me a little bit before that, but by that time it was done. And it's a shame too, because, you know, I know everything can't last forever. And like you mentioned earlier, every 5 years or so, you kind of see this turn and this shift. I just wish the turn was less bad.
Did you
you know.
feel? I mean, in the film, they mentioned about, was it because there was not much struggle in people's lives? There was nothing. There wasn't Vietnam. There wasn't an economic kind of hardship.
Yeah.
The times were too. Everyone was having too good a time. There was just nothing to rebel against apart from just let's get more hedonistic. And for the Rolling Stone editor, they're just put more breasts on the cover. It's what
Yes.
sells. I mean, it's
Yeah.
quite a lad culture, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think you're right. I think that there was really, people were comfortable. And there was nothing to rebel against. There was nothing culturally, at least that I can really think of, that grabbed people's attentions and made them really think. So it was almost like a frat boy, culture, a college party culture. Um, And I know people personally. I knew them then, and I know them now, who would go to shows just to cause problems. You know, they would go because it was just something to do. They didn't give a shit about the music. They didn't care. They weren't. They weren't intellectually vested in what was happening in the scene or the lyrics, or they didn't know much about the bands, if anything at all. It was just kind of the place to be, and they ruined it. You know, they you know, them and the bands that allowed, I guess, that to happen in a way, and the record companies. Let's not leave them out, because they would bring, like, let's face it, back then, before streaming, before digital, before any of that, um, the record companies would make a band. They would create, not create necessarily, but they would make them big, and they would get everybody's attention and make you almost go listen to them. So the labels didn't care, so the bands didn't care, and then ultimately the audience didn't care, and it just became a
Yes.
mess.
And did you, I mean, I don't know if you mentioned it in the book, but Douglas Copeland, is it Copeland? Who sort of did Generation X, didn't he? And he did another one called Girlfriend in a Coma and Microsurfs. Did he come into your consciousness at all?
No, not really. I mean, I know him now and the work now, but no, I don't remember that personally.
No, because it was, I suppose at that time I was a bit older, and I was probably Britpop was kind of what I was kind of mostly listening to, with the occasional bit of post, never mind grunge. But it was, I think sometimes the sound of it just was a bit like a bit samey, and
Yeah.
then there was the image as well, the Jack Daniels, the look, the hair, the songs about problems with your stepdad. It was almost a little bit like, blimey O'Reilly, this is not good, is it? So there was
Yeah.
there was something a bit basic at times, wasn't there?
Yeah, there absolutely was, and and I wrote this in the book too. Like, at some point, you people, they've had enough. Like, you don't want to be sad forever. You don't want to be complaining about stuff forever. You don't want to be, not being able to get over your issues forever. You don't want that to be the case, and you don't want to listen to it for years at a time. So in my mind, that's why in the States, because Britpop was certainly popular here, there's no doubt, but also what was popular were boy bands and girl bands, and very poppy dance music, and just, let's have a good time, because these guys from Seattle are bringing me down. I'm done with that. I'm done with the depression. I'm done with all of that. I need to dance. I need to have fun. I need to sing about nonsense, and not feel bad anymore. So I think that played a role. I mean, even me, like, after a while, I was like, okay, like, yeah, it's about time. I guess it's time to move on. Let's find something else. That's the great thing about music, though, and records. And now we have, the digital version. It never goes
Yes.
away. It never goes away.
Yes. So in your book, chapter 12, you finish 1999. That was when we were interested in the Millennium Bug, weren't we? We got very excited. It was a bit of an anticlimax, that one. And obviously, the wonderful Bill Clinton, who, a bit like Tony Blair, we had so much optimism. And it's like,
Yeah.
oh my God, guys, this
Yeah.
is really hard. Your legacy has been ruined so badly. So was that, was that how you wanted to frame the book, finishing it on the sort of the end of the decade?
Yeah, I did, and there were two things, and the reason I focused mainly, I believe, on Eminem and Napster. Napster sort of was the precursor to what we now know as streaming. That was the beginning of it. The writing was on the wall. The record labels were the old way was clearly in trouble, and Eminem, on the non-business side of things, I guess on the creative side, you'd say, uh, basically showed everybody what was coming and what people really wanted. And I was okay with Eminem for sure, because I was already a fan of hip hop and rap music and all that. So I embraced that. Napster, I didn't embrace quite so much. But yes, I wanted to end it that way, because those were the two, in my mind, the two biggest things that changed. Maybe not change. Well, it certainly changed, but I was thinking more of, okay, if you think anything is left from the early 90s, if you think there's anything left of grunge or anything at all from that period, these two things should show you that, no, it's all gone.
Yes.
It's over. Yeah.
So did you think Woodstock 99 should have been or could have been just included in a how because the 60s, I mean, it's kind of interesting, doesn't it? It starts so well, there's a good middle bit, but it does finish with the death of Hendrix, Morrison and Joplin, and there's Altamont, and actually Woodstock, the actual festival was a disaster. I mean, it made a brilliant film, but it's bad. And you got Charles Manson, and most of them finish. The bands break up, but I know the Rolling Stones still has their golden moment. But it's kind of, I don't know. It kind of does end badly, and I just wondered if you ever thought, well, perhaps I should put in Woodstock '99 just to say it did start well, but boy.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and I did. But what changed my mind a little bit was the interview I did with Tracy Bonham, because she did talk about that. There's that one piece about her and Sheryl Crow being flown into Woodstock '99, and seeing, like, to perform or whatever, and the helicopters landing, and they're looking. I think, if I remember right, it was DMX maybe who was on stage at the time that their helicopter was landing, and Tracy and Sheryl Crow were talking and seeing all these, big steroid white guys with baseball hats on backwards fighting in the crowd, and they looked at each other, and they knew it was over. Like, that was the moment, like, for them anyway. So in Tracy's interview, where I put a lot of Tracy's interview in, I think that was I forget the chapter it's in, but I referenced it there, that was the end, coming from someone who was physically there. So I didn't want to put it back again at the very end, but it certainly would have been. I mean, look, it could have been a very fitting ending for sure, because I agree with you. Like, it was horrendous, and it was. It probably was, the absolute nail for sure. I just, you know what? I don't remember. I mean, I guess that must have happened in the summertime, right, of '99. I don't remember exactly the month it was in, but certainly in the second half of the year, I guess. So yeah, it would have been a very fitting ending, but because I had Tracy's comment in there, I just left it there.
Yes. And I love the book. I think it's fantastic. When did you start putting this together? When did you start sort of thinking, right, I need to do a book here?
So it was 2020. It was April, right in the middle of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And I had heard either a radio show or maybe it was a podcast. I don't remember what I was listening to that day. And people were talking about 1991, musically, culturally, whatever. Just that year came up in this conversation I was listening to, and I was in my backyard. I was watching my dog play and just hanging out. We were all stuck at home. We couldn't go out. And when I was just thinking, and I was remembering back to the show I was listening to, and it struck me that, wow, 1991. I mean, one of my favorite years musically. And like I said, this is 2020, so I'm thinking in my head, like, next year, meaning 2021, is going to be 30 years removed from 91. And in my mind, when people would bring up the 90s, I always kind of feel like it was only 10 years ago.
Yes, well, I have the same.
Yeah. So I was like, man, 30, how did 30 years go by? Where did they go? Like, how did I end up here with, I have a wife, I have two kids, I have, this different life. And I'm like, what happened? Not that that's bad at all. It's terrific, but from an individual point of view, and realizing how long ago that was, I just said, you know what? I just had an idea, and I went inside and I started taking notes and writing things down that I remembered from that time period. And I've always been, I've been a freelance music writer for a while, and I would always try and come up with things to write about and send to people, and publish. So after a couple of weeks of writing these thoughts and these memories of those early '90s days, I started to realize that, wait, this is more than just my memory. This is a book. This is a story. This is something. And I had never attempted to write a book before. I didn't know the first thing about it. I didn't know if anyone would pick it up. I didn't know if I would publish it myself, nor did I know how to. But I just knew there was something there. There was a story somewhere in there. And I guess I was right. It turned into a book.
My God. So that was 3-4 years of hard work on this.
Yeah.
My God.
Yeah.
Did you enjoy the kind of, was it quite a process? I mean, did you have to dig deep on emotional sort of memories and bring up stuff that you'd slightly buried and,
Very.
yes,
Yeah. It was
navigate
very
certain different and difficult moments?
Yeah, and I have to give the publisher and the editors from Inspired Girl and Inspired by You Books. It's a subset of Inspired Girl Enterprises, which published the book. When I would send in my drafts and things like that, and for the editing process, they were like, "We see what you're doing. We know we can tell that you're putting a lot of yourself out in this book." But I didn't do it in the way that you read it because it wasn't the final draft. They said, look, um, it's admirable to go there, but if you're going to go there, really do it. Really go there. Like I was hinting at things, I was talking
Right.
around or writing around things. And I said, you know what? You're right. These men and these women who wrote these songs that I was writing about had real serious problems as well. They had more problems than I did. I never had a drug problem. These people were in pain, and they were writing it for all to see, all to listen to. And I thought, with the publisher, I was like, "You're right. I owe it to whoever's going to read this book to be as honest as I can be, because I'm writing about people whose music I was attracted to because of their honesty. So why not do the same thing?" And it was difficult, and I had to take breaks. I took weeks long, breaks. So in one stretch, I think I took a couple of months off of writing anything because, there was some trauma there, and there was some stuff to relive, which wasn't fun. But I owed it to the book, and I think it made a much better book than I initially submitted.
Yes.
Yeah,
It must have been quite enjoyable going through that process, not just emotionally, but also just as a writer, sort of having to rewrite or sort of, yeah, just dig deep
yeah,
and sort of find your voice and get it to the place that you want it to be. So yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So then after the 90s, how do you then, what's your next period? Do you still have that interest in music? Do you still find it as thrilling as you did back in those 80s and 90s periods?
It's a really good question because for a while the answer was no. The answer, no, I never stopped loving music ever. There wasn't a day in my life that went by where music wasn't playing, at least in a portion of the day. But I was playing all the old stuff, all the way back to the Beatles and through, the early metal stuff and the punk and grunge. It's what we were talking about this whole time. I would just go back to all of it. And probably around the mid 2000s, so we're in 2025, probably 2010, maybe a little earlier than that, 2008. I started to get back into new music that was out then, not as much as the 90s or the 80s, but it was the beginning for me. I was starting over again, like, okay, I really want to get interested in new music again. And so from that point on, as time had progressed, I do love listening to new music. It's one of the things I don't love streaming in some ways because I don't think it pays the artists fair enough at all. I think it took the album away from a lot of people. There'll be generations that don't know what it was like to go to a record store, grab a record, flip the back, or flip the cover and look, and then pull it out when you get home and read the lyrics and
Yes.
all that stuff. So streaming took a lot of that away. But what it's great for is the algorithms know what you like. So then they suggest, well, if you like this, you might like this. They're not always right, but sometimes they really, really do nail it. And you're introduced to a band you probably never would have found or heard of. So it's a good way to discover new music. And then when I do find a band that I really like, I then go and buy their vinyl, or I'll support, like I'll buy a t-shirt or something. I'll try and support the band that way. So yeah, I took some time off before getting back into new music, and now I absolutely love finding new stuff.
Yes. So did you become a writer, or did you have other adventures in life as well? Did you start a record label? Did I?
I did. I started a record label, and it's funny. This goes back to David Bowie. I started a record label initially the idea was in 2015. I was laid off. Well, I was laid off in 2016, but from my corporate job. And in 2015, I had this idea of, you know what, I always wanted to put music out. Again, just like a book, I didn't know how to do it, but I was curious and determined. And then 2016 comes around. We get laid off. My whole department, there was about 19 of us. We all got laid off from the job. And I said, all right, now's the time. I was in my early 40s, I guess, or whatever it was. And I said, now's the time. Let me do this. Let me give it a shot. And I had two partners, a very good friend of mine and a cousin of mine, and we got together and uh, we decided to do it. And it was because of a girl that I saw sing on YouTube. She covered "Life on Mars," David
Right.
Bowie, and I was blown. She was a kid. She was 15 years old, maybe 16 years old. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me with this, her voice and the way and the production of the music, because she wasn't singing over Bowie's track. She was singing over a redone, I could tell it was a redone version of the track. Long story short, I got in touch with her, like the contact was her father. And he's a musician and he recreated the music a bit. And she sang over it. And I was like, wow, like this girl's voice. I used to tell people she sounded like, or like her vibe was, if you can imagine Fiona Apple
Right.
singing for Radiohead. That was the combination of her vibe. And I said I want to work with her, and and I eventually did. And then from there it went to a guy who played jazz bass guitar, but funk and hip hop as well, and he was from the States. Then there was a Riot girl band, and then there was like an American, I guess you would call it like a folk punk sort of, kind of thing. So yeah, I did, and I put records out. I put vinyl out. I put digital music out. I helped create a couple of music videos. Um, everything we invested in it, we lost. We didn't make any money, but we have our records in different countries. We sold records in different countries all around the
Blimey. What
world.
was the label called?
It was called Sound Evolution Music.
Right. Blimey. I'll have to
So
check this
yeah,
out.
it was fun. It was a lot of work. I learned a ton about the record industry and the music industry, or I guess it's one and the same. Um, and then honestly, I don't know what would have happened. I don't know if it would have ever gotten, even you know somewhat big or big for an indie. But when COVID hit, it didn't make any sense to continue because nobody could record, nobody can go to record studio,
Yes.
recording studios, nobody made it. So that's kind of when that ended. And then I focused on writing again because I had always written, like I said, even in the early days of the internet, or the early days of what would become social media, I guess. In 2004 was my first one. I had a column on a website called thetruthmagazine.com, which doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. But I stole the title. The title of my column was stolen from a Fugazi song or a Fugazi album called "A Steady Diet of Nothing."
Right.
And I would just write like a monthly column about music and whatnot. So I then after the record label, I focused on writing, and then eventually the book happened, and now the book was just optioned for a documentary. Um, so that is probably happening within a year. So it's been just crazy, like that the evolution of all that.
My God, that's amazing, isn't it? That's just
Yeah,
so much has happened in this decade, which is
it's
just must
wild.
be thrilling.
Yeah,
Yeah, that is.
yeah.
And have you done any tours with this book as well? Have you done any kind of bookshops and places?
Yes, so I wouldn't call it a tour yet, although I'd like to eventually do it. But yes, in New York, New York and New Jersey, I've been to many book signings, including one or two Barnes and Noble, which was pretty wild to be in a big place like that. But also small bars. We've done things called grunge nights, which we go into a bar, we set up a whole thing, we have live music. I speak a little bit. We do a Q&A. I read from the book a little bit. We do music trivia. We just make it a fun night. And I've done that probably at this point, we've probably done about 10 or 15 different types of promotion like that. And I want to do more. It's just, like I said, 2 kids and a life, and
Yes.
it's hard to do all of this stuff, especially at my age too, because it's although I say that not meaning that I'm old, but you know, the media and things that become popular in media, usually it's a younger person's game, right? 20-year-olds and teenagers and things like that. So I do plan on making a little bit more of a proper tour at some point. The book was released on Amazon and all the other outlets, so Barnes and Noble, all these places online that you can get it on June 3rd of this year. So once that happened, it's making its rounds now, and I'm getting inquiries from different people to talk about it and promote it. So I think that will probably lead to whatever we can pull together here and create, some sort of a tour, even if it's a small one.
Yes, I do find it's the passing of time kind of does help. I think when I started doing lots of these interviews for the C86 indie scene, there wasn't 8 years ago. There wasn't that much interest, but suddenly, there's been a fascination for a lot of the
Yeah.
indie bands that were even below the Smiths and all these kind of like the Cult and the Cure and Susie and the Banshees and the Mission.
Mhm.
It's like people go, but what else is there? And it's, oh my God, there's loads more here. And I guess time, like you were saying, I realize you get old when you try and reminisce, or you're not reminiscing but looking back, and you think, oh yeah, that was 10 years ago, and you think, wait a minute, it can't be, and you start counting with your fingers going, oh no, actually that isn't 10, it's 20, no, it's 30.
It's very,
That's kind of a period that it took a long time, but everything was like, oh, it was probably like 10 or 15 years, and then you go, no, that was 30 years. So how
yeah.
did that happen? Where did the time? But then I realized, and I think some of it is looking back with rose-tinted sunglasses, but some of it I think is a bit deeper. I think people have reevaluated some of the music. I think for me, I've kind of gone back to listen to the music I missed the first time, not necessarily listen to the music I listened to, because it's like I'm a bit bored with it now.
Mhm.
But I confess. But it's like, oh God, there's all these other bands that came out, and actually that was quite an interesting scene. So I think, and people now have a bit more time and a bit more money, but also reflection. I think emotionally, it's like, as Sandy Denny once sung, who knows where the time goes, that famous song with Fairport Convention. And I think, you do just think, what's it all about? And, then you've got all these bands reforming because they think, well, it's probably going to be quite handy for our pension plan as well. And,
That's right.
we haven't done much else, and there's no one's going to be interested in my solo project of a jazz odyssey prog rock kind of thought. So let's just reform and play the old hits. And it's like, actually, they're all doing it, aren't they? And I'm sure part of it is an emotional need, and part of it's financial, but there is an audience for it as well. And so I guess
Yeah.
people are going to want to start looking back at the 90s like it was a distant memory, but actually, as you said, it is. But then Live Aid is 40 years, and that freaks me out. So
Yeah. Well, I think what I've done with the book, and what you do with your show, and what people from our, even though it's not a big gap. I mean, our generation, I'll put them together for now, because it really isn't that many years. Um, we're at the age now where I think looking back is inevitable, but it's also important. It gives us maybe some perspective on life, like. Uh, Sometimes they're happy times we look back on, but sometimes they're not so happy. But we obviously, if we're here talking about it, we made it through and we're okay, and everything is an experience anyway. And uh, I think most of us are probably at the age and maturity level where we should be telling these stories now. We should be looking, because everything was told to us at one point, right? I
yes.
wasn't around when the Beatles started. I wasn't around when Led Zeppelin started. I wasn't around for that, but I was sort of taught what that was, and then I got to listen to the music and make my own judgments. But to your point about like this being a big thing now, the '90s, I see young kids as young as 5 years old, 7 years old, and I know it's not them, but they're wearing Nirvana shirts. They're wearing Smashing Pumpkins shirts. And I know their parents are buying it for them and putting them on. And I know it's more of a fashion statement than anything else. But, I remember, the same thing happened with the Rolling Stones. You see Rolling Stone shirts on all ages of people,
And
because the logo.
yes, and the
And the
Ramones was
Ramones.
the
The Ramones
Ramones.
is a great one, yes. So,
CBGBs.
Right. So nostalgia is important, and I think when you reach a certain age, and maybe let's call it 50 plus, um, we're the right age to. We were there, right? We were right in those prime years when a lot of this was happening. So we're the ones who can tell the story. I mean, a 20-year-old, could write this book, but it's not firsthand, and that person is just doing research as opposed to recollecting and giving examples from the times it happened. So if we don't write this stuff, or if you don't do shows about it, how are we going to pass it along to people?
Yes. I think
So
what's
I think
quite
it's
interesting, because I used to get given tickets to go to the theatre in Norwich quite a lot and see these shows, which are all based on like 50s and 60s music. And I was thinking, as I was looking at the audience who are really old, thinking, well, they're not going to be around in 10 years' time. So theatres are
right.
going to have to start having productions. And I was thinking they're going to have to be productions with music from the punk period or the
Right.
80s or the 90s. And I did an interview with someone who's written a play that's going to have the music of The Wedding Present, which I must admit was quite niche, I thought, but good luck to him. He's probably not going to run for that long. But, I think it will be interesting when that music and culture suddenly gets brought into another mainstream form of entertainment, like the theatre, and how people are going to start to use these songs in some sort of theatrical context, whether it's going to be pretending to be the band or making it the music for some story and narrative, which is probably going to be about growing up and love and loss and all that kind of stuff and betrayal. But it's people aren't going to want to watch the Frankie Valli story and this story and that story from these bands, are they? Because
Right. It's
our
not there.
generation, our
Right.
generation are going to slowly start getting the inheritance tax, which obviously helps you pay to go to the theatre for one thing and buy the vinyl box set and all that kind of malarkey. And you want to go to the theatre to hear the music of, Soul Asylum and Soundgarden and such people, don't you? And that will be
You're
whoever
exactly.
writes that will cash in, I think.
No, well, you should write it because you're exactly right. You're exactly right. Like we will be sitting in theaters, on your side of the pond or mine, and we're going to be wearing old, ripped up, you know, Soundgarden shirts, and we're going to be watching probably some hologram performance of those times and those bands, because that will be our old. I mean, let's face it, they'll call it oldies. The oldies
Yes.
music is only old to the people who didn't witness it. It's not old to us necessarily. I mean, yes, it is, but you know what I mean. Like that was our music. So yeah, there will come a time when you mentioned Frankie Valli. So we'll find somebody who's still alive, who can still sing, who'll be 85 years old, and we'll go to the theater and watch them sing hits from the 90s. It's going to
Yes.
happen. You're right. Um,
It'll
so
be.
but
But
that's why it's important to do what we're doing, I think.
yes, well, I did an interview with a guy he musically didn't really do well, but he's written various books on music, so that's been good. But he plays guitar in care homes, and he said it's really good now because he's of a certain age where he would have to play from the 60s and 70s, and now he's like, God, I can go to these care homes, great audience, obviously, and they're
Captive, for
not,
sure.
and they're quite captive and sometimes got dementia, and he's playing stuff from the Clash in the 90s, 80s,
Yeah.
and the 90s now, and
Yeah.
he's really enjoyed it. He's like, I've never made so much money, and I'm so popular, and my audience loves me, and I just thought that was just wonderful. I mean, because they're making, which is, I think, could be a disaster, Spinal Tap, aren't they? The follow up. And I thought, oh God, that's going to be quite difficult. And I thought if they could do it in a way that, it's one of the members did play. Said, yeah, how's your musical career? And said, yeah, brilliant. I'm playing every day. And it's like, it turns out they're in a care home playing to, these old folk who've got dementia or something. I thought that would be good. And then I thought, oh, they've got Elton John and Paul McCartney. I thought, this could be a
Ooh.
difficult watch, couldn't it, really? Spinal Tap.
Yeah.
What's your
I,
feelings on making this sequel?
for Spinal Tap?
Yeah.
Uh, well, I mean, sequels. When I hear a sequel is coming out for anything, there's no surprise. I mean, they're trying to
No.
go back to the box office, try to make money. Um, I don't know. I mean, Spinal Tap is such a brilliant movie when it came out. I mean, still is. If I watch it now, I still laugh. I know the lines, I know what's coming, but yet I still laugh.
Yes.
Is it done? Is it like Rob Reiner did that, right?
Yes,
Is he
I think
doing
I
this?
think it's coming out next month.
And he did it. Rob Reiner did it with the.
Yeah, I think they're all there.
Okay, well,
I think I've seen the trailer a little bit. I'm not sure if they're still in some editing process. The trailer's there, and the little clips of it. It all looks a little bit like, yeah, I think it's set for the theaters this autumn.
okay, well, you know what? If I mean, I'm biased probably because I loved it, and I understand the joke. I get it, and the making and the poking fun and all that. Uh, my gut instinct is I'd watch it. I'm curious. I'm interested. You
Yes.
know, it's a bit of again. You know, I think it falls into that whole nostalgia thing. Like people will see this second one. You know, many of them will see it if they choose to for the first time. Meaning, of course, they'll see that for the first time, but they won't know there's a they never would have seen the first one perhaps, and they'll just see this and maybe not understand. But for people like us who lived through the first one, yeah, I'm interested.
Yes. Well, I'll do, because actually in your book you mentioned Tracy Ullman, don't you?
Yeah, but with the Simpsons, yeah,
Yes. So how
yeah.
did you come across such a British person?
Channel 5, which was Fox News, or not Fox News, Fox. Well, I guess it's Fox News now, but when I was a kid, the Fox channel was Channel 5 in New York, and the Tracy Ullman Show was a show. It was a thing. It was a it was a I guess a sitcom or a sketch comedy or whatever it was, and they played 5 minute clips, 2 minute clips, whatever they may have been. I don't remember exactly the amount of time. Um, they would play little clips of this thing called The Simpsons,
Oh,
and
yes.
the drawing, like the art, like what the Simpsons. When you say Simpsons now, and you think of Homer and Bart, and you have the image of what they look like in your head, the initial characters didn't look like that. They resembled them, but they were drawn differently. They had some different facial features. But I remember it being so bizarre and so weird. Um, it was it was I don't know. I guess as interesting to me as maybe when I heard Space Oddity. No, like I know what happens is like I think culturally, if you're paying attention or if you're just a fan of culture and music and art, the second you see something that you know is different, something happens. And then the first time I saw one of those little clips of The Simpsons, I was like, "This is strange, man. What is this?" I'm very curious, and
Yes. I
you
think
know,
before the early 90s, we had the young ones. I don't know if you ever watched the young ones, but that was
yeah,
this. It was like this change in comedy in the UK where you had the 70s comedians. It was just, really cringy jokes about, mother-in-laws, and it was
yeah,
very
yeah.
sexist and racist and
Well,
homophobic. It was the
like
whole
Benny
lot.
Hill,
Yes,
was it
Benny
like Benny
Hill.
Hill?
Yes, all
We had
these
that here. Yeah,
and various other comedians, and it was like very much. And then suddenly this new sort of comedian came out, who were just it was just a younger person who was just a bit more aware that actually, racist jokes and all that sexist stuff and the mother-in-law joke was just, it was so tired. So it's, and the younger, it's like that suddenly the 16-year-old came along like myself, and you didn't want to watch all these old comedians from the 70s. You wanted your own comedians who were doing things that your parents would go, oh my God, this is the worst thing ever. And then you
yeah,
realize that's what suddenly it appeals even more, doesn't it? Because they don't
yeah,
get it. You completely get it.
yep,
And it all works because you didn't really get their humor.
right.
And it's brilliant because in a way it would be very confusing if your parents were there smoking a joint, going, oh, I love this. And you go, God, this is too weird. I can't, like,
Right.
oh, let's go to Glastonbury Festival together. You think, this is getting too weird, Dad. Whereas it's easy to just, you didn't have to be that rebellious to be rebellious in my day. It was just like,
Yeah,
wow, watch the young ones, suddenly listen to something, some punky music. That was it,
yeah,
your way.
yeah. And
So,
I think we all, whether it's on a subconscious level or eventually as we get older, a conscious level, we want our own thing or we want our own things. Like we want to be either part of a scene or identify with a certain style of music or film. You're talking about comedians, and immediately in my head, for me that was Eddie Murphy.
right.
Eddie Murphy came on the scene in the early '80s, and then later on, and but that was with Delirious, and then with Raw in 1987. Um, Here's this guy in a leather suit cursing every other word, and funny as hell. our parents hated it,
Well,
you know,
yes.
because of the vulgarity and things like that. But to your point, like, we weren't interested in what they were thought was funny. We were interested in this. This is crazy. This is wild. Listen to what he's saying. And it resonated. And, yeah, like, that's a good point. Like, we could be rebellious by just watching something.
Yes,
We didn't
because
have to go
just a
do
few
anything.
years earlier, I remember Channel 4, the fourth channel in our kind of three-channel nation. We had the Richard Pryor. There was a
Oh,
live show of Richard Pryor. So I think that sort of was another one of those. You definitely didn't
absolutely.
want your parents hearing that. And then we
No,
had Bill Hicks and various other people. There
genius.
was an
Bill Hicks was
amazing
genius.
thing called Talk Radio. There was a film in the 80s, Talk Radio, which
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't remember the guy, but he was a bit of a comedian, and then Robin Williams as well. And
I
yes,
remember it. Yeah. I
they
remember that.
they were all kind of important films, weren't they,
Yeah.
of our times? But yeah, no,
Absolutely.
it's I suppose the culture of the 80s and then obviously the 90s. You have your films, you have your music, you have your fashion, and yes, it's always there. Even if you put it away in the bottom drawer of your cupboard, it's still fun. But
Yeah.
look, thank you ever so much for this. This has been amazing. If you want, I can always send you a link to this fascinating interview, and
Yeah.
you can always use it on any of your social media platform sites. You're more
I
than
will. I
welcome.
will. Thank you so much, and I really do appreciate it and reaching out.
Yes,
Lovely, lovely conversation. I can talk about this stuff all day, especially with like-minded people, because you get it, and it's a very interesting topic. And I'll certainly promote it. Just let me know how to, like, what where it should go
yes.
out, or different social media sites. Send me everything, and I'll tag you in all of it.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you ever so much, and have a lovely evening, and I'll
All right.
keep in touch. But yeah, thanks again for sending the PDF. Marvelous stuff. Okay,
Absolutely.
take care
Thank you,
then.
David.
Thank
It
you.
was a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye. An emotional finish there. Massive thank you to Rob for giving me the time for that interview. Like I said, I'll put a link in his to his website in the notes below. This has been the C86 Show. If you want to contact me, you can. You'll be able to find me on any of those social media platform sites. Just do C86 Show and my name. All these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. Check them out. Anyway, have a great week. Stay safe.